Afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Shu. I'm a board member of the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, or APIC, and a current MPP student at USC Price. Thank you for joining us today for conversations with Interim Dean Goldman and the USC Price Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, featuring John Chung, California's 33rd State Treasurer. Before we start today's conversation, I wanted to share some background about APIC. The USC Price Asian Pacific Islander Caucus is focused on three issues. One, raising awareness about the political and policy issues affecting Asian Pacific Islanders. Two, empowering marginalized communities. And three, advocating for social justice on and off campus. Our mission is to provide social and professional opportunities to all members of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, community interested in Asian Pacific Islander issues, and concerns affecting the fields related to policy, planning, and development. I personally first met Treasurer Chung when I was working in the district office of a California State Assemblyman. Though he was a constitutional officer and I was but a lowly staffer, he took the time to introduce himself and speak with me on occasions where we were attending the same functions, even inviting me to a poker game where I quickly realized that his finance acumen did not only extend to managing the state's investments, but also towards crushing his opponents at the poker table. John served as California's 33rd State Treasurer from 2015 to 2019. He is currently a member of the USC Price Board of Counselors and a fellow with the Dornsife Center for Political Future. He is on the board of directors of Apollo Medical Holdings, Inc., Aegis Systems, and Zeus Technologies. In addition, he serves on the advisory boards of Pasadena Private Finances and Calix Peak. Hosting today's conversation will be Interim Dean Dana Goldman, Interim Dean of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, the Leonard D. Schaefer Director's Chair of the USC Schaefer Center, and Distinguished Professor of Public Policy, Pharmacy, and Economics. Since its inception, Dr. Goldman has led the USC Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics, one of the nation's premier health policy programs. Please join me in welcoming them, and thank you again for joining us today. Make sure to send in any questions to the Q&A.
Thank you, Adam. I think if you could say interim 2 more times, it'll be really good for my ego. No, I just want to thank APIC for putting on this event and for all you have done for raising awareness to both issues that affect Asians in our society and Pacific Islanders, as well as raising policy awareness. And I can't think of a better webinar for me to participate in than this one, because John has been a hero of mine for quite some time. He doesn't know this, but I know that he has presided in key positions during some of the greatest financial crises that I've witnessed in the 30-something years that I've lived in California. And I think it's very instructive, John, if you don't mind, if we spend a little time and talked about some of them, because they're in the rearview mirror now, but they may have lessons for us as we move forward in this state. So I want to roll back the clock to when you were controller around 2008, when the Great Recession happened, and California, which is like every state, needs to balance its budget. And the fact that the stock market had crashed and we rely a lot on income-based earning revenue meant that we had blown a massive hole essentially in California's budget, and we're facing a calamitous budget deficit. And at the time, I know you had to take some steps, which included issuing IOUs. The governor had to furlough employees. Tuition hikes at the public universities went up around 30%. And we just had to deal with this massive hole. And could you talk a little bit about that and how you see any parallels or differences with what's going on in this recession today?
Absolutely. Dana, first, I'm happy and honored to join you. Really appreciate all the work you're doing as the interim dean. So that's one time mention of interim. And then I want to thank Adam for the warm words of introduction. I assumed the role of state controller, which is the state's accountant and cash manager, in 2007. And one of the hallmarks that I try to do in my public service was to give power to the people, right? Politics is about the exercise of power. And information is one of those steps towards power. And we know in the financial world, who has knowledge about the finances makes a monumental and material difference. So in starting my third month in office, it took a couple months to gear up. I started publishing on a monthly basis the state's cash report, what revenues we received, what disbursements we were making, and how much cash do we have in the state's bank account. Now, what was unusual was on, I think it was July 15th, 16th, or 17th, my staff comes to me and they go, John, the state's operating in cash deficit, right? And we think, how is the state operating in cash deficit? The economy is doing relatively well, right? We have housing issues in the state, but employment is fine, right? The recession is not officially declared until the end of 2007, right? And then we have the financial crisis the next year. But that just started to show a signal that California was in trouble. And then you pointed to 2008. It was a scary time for us in the controller's office, right? It's a felony for the controller to bounce a check, right? Each month, as the controller, we would issue 44 million disbursements. One of the practices, we always maintained a $2.5 billion cash reserve. But we saw the economy tanking. During that recession, California lost 1.34 million jobs. So prior to the recession, 15 million people were paying their taxes to the state of California. It fell to below 14 million. So we started to see the tension, and we saw the financial institutions getting in trouble. So I had to figure out how to pay the bills. I was challenging the governor and legislature. People said, hey, he's doing that politically, just for political points. You don't score political points that way, right? I have to live with them on a daily basis. Right, getting on the wrong side of the governor is not a good thing, because he could basically dismantle your office, right? He can basically shut down your office. So one of the big battles I had with the governor was he wanted to reduce state workers' pay. And so they said, John pulled that last minute surprise on the governor, which was not untrue. We had told the governor's office 9 months earlier, Governor, if you take this tack, we're going to disagree with you and we'll go to court over it. So you'll have media reporting on some things that simply wasn't accurate. And then on the other side, trying to figure out how to pay the bills. As I just shared with you a couple moments ago, I had Lehman Brothers on the other side of the table. I had Wells Fargo and Bank of America, right? So we had three firms that were under discussion for blowing up, right? And Lehman Brothers did blow up during that recession. So it was, as they point out, it was the worst of times from a cash perspective. And then, as you pointed out, I took action. I issued 450,000 IOUs to the tune of $2.6 billion to keep California from defaulting on debt. Now, why is it important not to default on debt? Because you don't want to freeze the finances of the state, right? Everybody starts suing. We're in court. And if we lose a court case, how do I pay the bills to the healthcare providers, to the state employees, for students, a whole host of other issues. So the last thing we want to do is be bogged down in court. The good news is today, because during that interim period, we had Governor Brown and others say we're going to be financially responsible. One of the things I did that was not popular during that crisis, I said we need to build a rainy day fund. And Governor Brown was an incredible champion. The voters of California were smart. They said, we want the state to be responsible with their finances like we try to be, right? And so we built up a significant reserve that we're using today. It's our greatest sources of funds. And the good news is, well, it's good and bad news. The California budget isn't being hit as badly as originally projected, right? They were talking about a $55 billion loss over a 2-year period of time. The rich people are still making a lot of money during this COVID-19. So they're going to be paying taxes. Unfortunately, we see the middle class and lower income Californians still being punished during these difficult economic straits.
Well, it does. Thank you for that. And also, it does show that there's a long tail to these decisions because, as you noted, that if we had defaulted back then, it raises our borrowing costs. And a lot of what we're doing in California and the investments we make are financed by bonds, and paying extra points on your interest affects the investments we can make in education and infrastructure and other resources. So again, there's this long tail to those decisions. It would have been it's very interesting to consider what would happen if something like this had happened to the federal government during this crisis. We know that those stimulus checks got out pretty rapidly, based in part on collaboration between the federal government and the states to get them out. The notion that if we couldn't get those stimulus checks out, when we know that a lot of Californians, as you rightly point out, are living month to month, in some cases week to week, or even day to day, it would have been, it could have been even more tragic than it already has been.
Yeah, Dana, you're incredibly observant and astute with your comments. When you think about over the long term, but also California needs to improve. Our leadership is trying. One of the incredible shortcomings of state and federal government is our lack of prowess and expertise in technology. So, our whole unemployment insurance will still today in California, 1.6 million people are not getting their unemployment insurance, has a material impact on their lives and the communities that they live in. So you spotted that critical issue. California needs to do everything they can to help those people in a terrible state at this given moment.
So the other thing we're learning as we start to come out, and hopefully we will, there's some good news on the horizon potentially for progress in terms of vaccines, and it's the hope that the economy eventually will recover over the next 2 or 3 years. But we still face some serious issues. We've underinvested in affordable housing, for example, and we're very concerned about the future of public and private education in California. How are we going to be able to make those investments? Are we going to have to raise taxes? Do we worry about our ability to compete with some of our neighbors who argue they have more favorable business environments?
We do have a very serious issue on that front, right? Having moved from the public to the private sector, we don't want necessarily the policies of Delaware, but we want the business approach of Delaware. So I'll give you an example. One of the companies that I am with is an LLC. Well, the legislature and the former governor signed legislation that allowed for C corps and sole proprietorships to operate as those businesses. They forgot to include LLCs. So our company had to go back, redraft its articles of incorporation, had to go back, do the filing fees, go back, renegotiate with our investors, go back to the Secretary of State's office, go back, get new insurance, right? And then there was a technical mistake on one of the applications where this attorney had worked with Wilson Sonsini, one of the prominent technology law firms in the Silicon Valley. In Delaware, a staff person from Delaware would said, hey, technically this doesn't work. Do you want us to correct this for you, right? We're happy to do it. Where here in California, they will reject you. And then another agency in the state government said, we want proof of insurance. We said, our proof of insurance is listed on the Secretary of State's website. The other government agency said, we want it in a letter. We said, you are not going to accept the fact that another California government agency has it listed on its website. They said, we want a letter, right? That's type of that bureaucracy that creates additional friction. They don't shut down a business, right? But it stalls progress and acceleration and focus and energy by a business on its core purpose.
Yeah, and this issue of starting a small business has been so important to the progress of immigrants in California, for example. So it has these social justice components to it as well. I mean, the large corporations, they can afford to hire a former state treasurer or controller to help them work through the bureaucracy. But, you know, a small business that's struggling to stay afoot, they don't have that option to do that. And so the things that we can streamline for people there really affect kind of all of us in the community.
Exactly.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about public service and how people contribute. We're a policy school. I also want to acknowledge the time. I also want to remind people they can ask questions via the Q&A chat, and please submit them. We're facing difficult times in higher education, and that we know that education matters for the workforce. It's a little different in a policy school. We're really training people to go out and be civil servants, and in a lot of cases, and to serve in just the way that you've served in your career. Could you talk a little bit about the skills that we need that you see that are needed in state and local government and even federal government, and how we can provide those to the community?
Well, let me extend kudos to the students at Saul Price, one of the agencies that I chaired during my tenure as the state treasurer. We were standing up some programs and plans, and a lot of those agencies are incredibly under-resourced. And the Saul Price School offers and tries to directly outreach, having worked with Harley and others here. Asking me earlier this semester about how we can outreach to another state constitutional officer's office, but they provided some essential services on the research. I was very happy to see them. They came up and testified at that particular agency as to the body of work that was very beneficial. But you need individuals who have great subject matter expertise, but we understand topically that material changes very dramatically. So you need people with refined and superior analytical skills. You need people especially at this time, and frankly, I think that was part of our federal elections. We need people who are collaborative. What I ask for in people who work for me and people that I look for in public service are serious, thoughtful, disciplined individuals of goodwill to fashion public policy. So that's the sort of set. And then I also use Warren Buffett's comments about what he looks for in hiring, right? You want somebody with high intelligence, somebody who works really hard, and somebody who has high integrity. And he said the first two are really important, but the third is the most important, because if you have somebody who's highly intelligent, who has high energy, but doesn't have integrity, you get really bad things happening.
That's interesting. And I'm not gonna make a joke about any current administration in response to that. But I do think that that echoes some words that I once heard Paul Volcker, who, as you know, was chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he addressed the recessions. He was the one who broke the stagflation that had started in the late 70s and 80s by raising interest rates, nominal interest rates, up into the 20% in some cases. And he once said that Americans have always had a healthy skepticism towards government, but now they have a corrosive cynicism towards government. And I do want to ask, there's a sense that, like you said, we have people who are very smart and who think about careers in civil service, and they get picked off by investment banking and consulting and other fields where the remuneration may be more, and sometimes the problems are very interesting. And how do we restore that confidence in the merit in going and serving in government. Is there anything we can do there?
I think there's having just taught this semester at the Dornsife Center for the Political Future and having some incredibly bright students. And one of my very bright students wanted to be an economic consultant. I brought it, the 10-week class, we brought in experts in the criminal justice field. I just appealed to them. I said, if you're passionate about housing, I know for a lot of progressives, especially young progressives, right, they look down on developers. But I said, who is going to build that housing for the homeless? And if you don't have the best and the brightest, and certainly if that's part of the community of folks that you need, I said, we need your talents, right? So you're going to have to overcome whatever preconceptions you have. And frankly, you can change those preconceptions by bringing the integrity of your character if you think the people who practice in that area lack character. And then we just need greater exposure to people in public service. You have people who are participating in this call. I saw Ellen Wapner and Kim Tachiki and Thomas Wong, who are either elected officials or work for elected officials. They are out actively in their community, not only as public servants, but as community volunteers. And I think you bring more faith and trust when you engage with them both personally and professionally.
Great. So I want to turn it over to Rit in a minute, but I want to ask you kind of the $10 trillion question, which has to do with unfunded liabilities, and it's coming through the Q&A as well. And I think Ben Bernanke said it best at one point. He was looking at the federal budget and he saw we've got the military, we've got Social Security, so we've got pensions, and then we've got healthcare. And he said the United States is a health insurer with a Navy. And, you know, those are the things that takes up about 88% of every federal tax dollar go towards things like pensions and healthcare. And the state is no different. And how do you see these liabilities? And we know we're facing this demographic crisis, and it doesn't happen quickly the way these recessions that we spoke about. This is a trend that just continues out. How do you see them affecting the competitiveness and our ability to invest and deal with these problems that you've articulated?
Well, continuing your reference, right, it's going to be sailing on rough seas. If you take that pension, right, and you imagine it, when they built the program, the actual assumptions and the investment assumptions actually worked. Right, when you used to have a discount rate, and it's not exactly the same thing, but roughly equivalent, your rate of return, and you would have a rate of return expected of 8%, right, and the equity market return was 8.5%. The fixed income portion of your pension would be 3.5%. You could meet those hurdles. And for a long time, they met or exceeded those hurdles. But as the United States economy advanced, right, and our GDP decreased, right, and it became more competitive, we understand that the initial assumptions, as they always do and they always will, right, so we can plan for today, but we have to anticipate what may happen in the future, became much more difficult, right? So they reduced the returns to 7%. But as I mentioned, fixed income, if you look at today where, right, the borrowing is at basically no cost because the Fed rate, and that reduces how much your expected investment return is going to be from fixed income, and your fixed income portion of the portfolio is 15 to 20%, you're thinking, trying to get a 7% return, where if we're doing the safe bonds and you're only making 1 to 2%, it's going to be really hard. So then we got to take more risk and maybe make 7 or 8%. But by taking more risk, you may actually lose money or have a lower return. And the equity markets, instead of expecting an 8.5% return, we're thinking today, maybe if you're looking at United States and you invest where you have a home field advantage, and you're looking at 6.5% and 6.75%, you're thinking, even in our portion of the portfolio that's supposed to have the greatest return, but also has more risk, it's going to be much more difficult. So they're going to have to keep working on taking down the rate. You're going to have the management and the labor come to return agreement on what those plans look at. And then worst of all, but it has happened, right? And frankly, it will apply more pressure. We have something called the terminated agency pool, where some of the employers were not able to make the pension payments. In one case, there was like some of the employees, I think of JPA, only 19% of the pension payments were made. They wanted to make CalPERS pay it, despite the fact that they didn't make their contributions. CalPERS took it to court. They prevailed, right? The employer responsible. So the employees and the employers renegotiated, right, to make sure that the employees got some type of return. That will happen more often unless more things are done. And then you mentioned pensions, but we have OPEB, which is the other post-employee benefits. It's one of the things that I highlighted. One of the things I also pushed is sort of interesting, right? I represented California, but the former Texas comptroller, a more conservative state, I wanted to make all that information public. The Texas comptroller, who you thought would have been to the right of me, wanted to not show that information. She didn't want to publicly disclose what the state's OPEB obligations are. Starting under Governor Brown, we started to pay down, but that's over an $80 billion responsibility for the state of California. And while we made some progress, we need to take more aggressive action to make sure it doesn't happen. When Stockton had its bankruptcies, they were writing stories about a 77-year-old retired firefighter who, because of Stockton's bankruptcy, he lost his health care. We don't want to put good public servants and others who have worked their entire life expecting health care not to receive it because those plans go under.
Very well said. And, I think we'll get some more in the Q&A. I want to turn it back to Rit for the Q&A portion to ask a few questions. Are you there?
Hi, Treasurer Chang. Just wanted to say that I'm so happy to be here today and ask you a few questions on behalf of the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus. And I'll start by asking, what perceptions do you think people may have had of you as a candidate as a result of your Asian Pacific Islander heritage, and how did that differ from reality?
Yeah, so Rick, great question, and thank you for APIC for co-hosting this gathering. So polling is incredibly expensive. As a Saul Price student, I'm sure you know. So we didn't poll specifically on the Asian question, right? Because you have different ethnicities, you have those who speak in language, those who speak a second language, but you could what you can tell the progress or lack of progress that's been made, just even today with the presidential races or major think tanks, think of how many of those major institutions do not poll Asian Pacific Islanders. It is very, very frequent, right? I'll get on a lot of think tank webinars, and I'll just actually thank the organization or the speaker. I'll just say, thank you for mentioning APIs, or thank you for including us in polling. But I would argue about 80% of the time, APIs are not included. And it happens not only with those organizations, it happens with public and private sector leadership. One of the things that I led when I was a board member at CalPERS and CalSTRS, in 2008, I led the effort, right, and now there's state law, for more people of color on corporate boards. In 2010, I led the effort for more women on corporate boards. A few years later, I advocated for more members of the LGBTQIA community on corporate boards. And then a couple of years later, I said we need more people with risk expertise, especially climate risk expertise on corporate boards. And so the legislation that was introduced earlier this year said, yes, we need more people of color, and they defined that as Latinos and African Americans. I'm not sure about Native Americans, but they excluded Asian Americans. In my 25 years of public service around then, I think in my hundreds or tens of thousands of meetings, I think only in 6 cases did somebody other than an Asian American mention, what are you going to do for the APIA community? Right. So part of that responsibility, I'm not blaming folks, but the community needs to be louder and work with our elected and private sector leadership to say you need to include us. right? I think America's response to this coronavirus was not optimal. It was suboptimal, clearly, because we didn't tap into the expertise of those who understand the Asian countries, right? And frankly, who knows the Asian countries better than those who were immigrants who came from this country, right? Taiwan hasn't had the inter-country passage of coronavirus in over 200 days, right? When I visited Taiwan, I asked for a healthcare briefing. They took me to a place where they treated people with SARS, right? They went through those practices. Why didn't the United States follow that practice, right? Why didn't we learn from Singapore? Why didn't we learn from New Zealand? Why didn't we learn from Germany? Why didn't we learn from Iceland? America's a great country, but we need to follow what other people have learned. They follow what the United States has done in the past and quickly caught up. We need to understand there are brilliant people all across this globe, and USC understood that earlier. Right? USC started recruiting international students, or especially international students from Asia, in the 1960s. The United States needs to follow the best practices established by USC in reaching out to the best today.
There's so many great points made in there. And I think the idea that diversity brings strength is obviously such a great theme. And the idea that like cognitive diversity will help solve the problems in the room that some people may not be able to is an absolutely excellent point.
There's books written on it.
So the next thing I want to bring up is that Asian Americans have some of the greatest economic success of any group in America. Yet in May of 2019, an NPR article stated that historically, Asian Americans have had lower voter participation rates, hovering around 30% in 2019 compared to 50% nationally. However, recent survey information from the Asian American Vote Survey shows increased enthusiasm for many API voters. Why do you think that low turnout has been the case in the past? And what do you think changed this election?
Yeah, so let me say it's not inconsistent with other ethnic communities. And if you look at, right, this isn't from the most recent information, but a decade ago, the people who tend to vote are people who are wealthy, who are older, who have home ownership, right? So some would argue a greater economic stake. When you add a sort of the wrinkle of many, but not all from Asian countries where politics was to be avoided, right? There would be great conflict. Part of the reason my dad came to this country was that my dad was studying to be a medical doctor, right, at National Taiwan University, the top university in Taiwan. My dad was protesting the government leadership. My grandfather was afraid for my dad's life. He said, quit protesting. Switched him to the engineering school. He graduated. Came out here. He said, go somewhere else. My dad came out here with his 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, right? Learned English and got his PhD. But part of that is that background. And in addition, when we get to the place of others, we haven't built within the API community with the support of others, the African American community, Latino community, women's community, others, have been more advanced and thoughtful about building an infrastructure to increase greater political participation. The Asians are starting to build that out, but it's not as defined and refined and robust as it needs to be so that our community, along with others, are fully participatory in our democracy, which is absolutely critical.
Right. And I think it ties into what you mentioned in that last question, where, we need to make our voices heard. And that's ultimately how you get catered to, right? So you need to make that a priority.
Yes.
So those are the 2 questions I have. Thank you again for your answers. And I'll turn it back over to Interim Dean Dana Goldman.
Thank you. Thanks, Rit. Good luck to you.
Thanks. Great questions, Rit. And thank you. It was really thoughtful answers as well, and quite a challenge. I want to follow up, if you don't mind, and feel free to join the conversation, Rit, if you like. But we had a proposition on the ballot, I think, that is really divides people in the Asian Pacific Islander community, which has to do with affirmative action. And voters in California have rejected any changes to our current law. I think that was the outcome. Could you talk a little bit about that? And it reflects I have a personal stake in that, having as a Jewish American whose grandfather was attended Harvard but was subject to a quota. I can reflect on his legacy experiences for these types of things. What is your position on this issue?
Yeah, I support affirmative action. I think so many of the commentary was lost in quotas, right? And it has been for a long time. Quotas have been and they are illegal. In my law school class, I sort of took the labor law track, and my professor was Elizabeth Holmes Norton. I believe she might have been the first EEOC chair. She's the DC delegate, right? So she said, if you take anything from this one class, quotas are illegal.
Right.
And I understand the fear, especially amongst immigrant Chinese, about the limiting educational opportunities. But the construct is you're not picking people who are unqualified. You're picking people who are qualified for the position, right? And it's hard for a lot of the larger universities. Frankly, with great respect to a lot of the larger universities, they can't go through every application. Right? They're not reviewing. So you try to find that benchmark. It doesn't excuse, right, whether you move forward with or don't move forward with that particular policy. But I think America has always been, and my public service career has been about creating better opportunities. And if we want to fix some historical anomalies is the wrong word, but and redirect America to a more inclusive and more prosperous path, right? We're going to have to overcome our structural educational disparities.
And I mean, the argument, it's interesting because when you talk to people about, do you think diversity in the classroom, diversity in the student body, diversity of thought is important for public education, private education? Virtually everyone agrees. And but you start to say, it's exactly what you say. So they agree with the goal. They just think quotas, I think, when they're presented, and maybe there's a lesson here for how we present to people what the policy solutions are here to ensure that we're getting the best out of the educational experience and that people are getting the right opportunities. Because there's also an important element of the equality of opportunity. And we know that there are a lot of inequalities that cross geographic areas and neighborhoods and affect different groups differently. And we want to make sure that education is about opportunity, and you want to make sure everyone has that opportunity. So
yeah, I concur.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're at the end of our time. I really, I'm not sure, do I turn it over to Adam? But I just wanted to say thank you very much. Again, thank you for your public service. Thank you for your efforts on behalf of the school. We really appreciate it. I want to thank APIC for putting this on and having an interest in doing it. And I will turn it over to Adam if he has some final words.
Interim Dean Goldman, thank you so much. And thank you, Treasurer Chung, for taking the time out of your day to chat with us here at the Price School. It's always a pleasure personally to speak with you, but I'm glad that everyone at the Seoul Price School of Public Policy was able to also benefit from your experiences and your wisdom in this regard.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Dana. Really appreciate it.
Yep, I think we're done then. Thank you all very much. Take care.